everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to use some ends of stock solution bottles to create a beautiful watercolor type colorway on a sparkle yarn base. Effectively, today we're using leftover dyes to create a colorway with a vision I have on my head. Still dyeing by feel and using what we have on hand, but I have saved all these until I had a yarn base and a project in mind. At the end of filming episodes for Dyepot Weekly, I often have leftover dye, and sometimes I throw those all together to leave no dye behind on a skein of yarn, or maybe I'll use an extra skein as a mop to wipe my hands on. And I definitely want to acknowledge the privilege that comes with having access to extra skeins of yarn, so it's no big deal to grab another skein. When I got started on my yarn dyeing journey, I took 100 grams of yarn and I stretched it. I mean, maybe you don't want to go back and look at some of the first ChemKnits videos. But in those, I was dyeing 3 grams of yarn to try to explore different techniques and let the yarn stretch as far as possible. So while you can use your leftovers up right away on yarn you have, you can also save your leftovers and your nearly empties until you have a project where you want to use them all and combine them all together. And so that is the sentiment behind our project today, and why I'm calling this Dyepot Weekly instead of Leave No Dye Behind, or maybe it's a Dyepot Weekly Leave No Dye Behind crossover, and I'll add this to both playlists. Before I show you the colors that I saved for this project, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to my lab partner today, Candice Markelis, for supporting this episode of Dyepot Weekly. Candice, thank you so much for being my lab partner, and well, let's go look at the colors. I have 5 stock solutions that are all at the dregs. The colors are Dharma True Black, Jacqaurd Fire Red, Dharma Purple Pop. I have the most of some Dharma Deep Purple. I probably have between 100 and 150 milliliters here, where I think of the rest there's probably between 20 to 60. And then finally some True Turquoise. And I actually, again, have a little more of this than some of the other colors. But my goal today is to take these colors and we're gonna layer them on 300 grams of Dyer Supplier Sparkle Sock yarn. This yarn is 70% merino wool, 20% nylon, and 10% silver stellina. So it has a nice sparkle. It's not as jam-packed as the silvery sock base, but it is still nice and sparkly. Now I've pre-soaked these overnight, maybe a little longer than an overnight, but I've pre-soaked them in plain tap water, and I've added on these reusable nylon zip ties to help keep the skeins ordered and it makes it easy to flip the yarn when we have it in the pot. If you'd like to learn more about any of the yarn or tools and equipment that I'm using in this video, I do have affiliate links down in the description to Dyer Supplier, Amazon, and more. I always try to include links to the things I use in the video description to make it as easy for you to dye along at home as possible. I'm adding a leftover dye bath that was used in another video. I believe it started with around 8 cups of water and lots of vinegar, so we have plenty of acid in there. Someone once asked how many times you can reuse a dye bath, and really the limiting factor is that eventually the volume of water starts to go away. So when I add more water and acid, it's usually because the water level got too low. But otherwise, you can reuse a dye bath over and over and over again. Now I'm coming over with our 300 grams of yarn. I squeezed out part of the pre-soak. One note on yarn with stellina, it can actually, maybe I need to remember and do this in a video and try to dull the stellina because I've never actually had it happen. But if you have conditions that are too acidic, then the stellina can start to lose its sparkle and shine. But this is not something that really happens with vinegar. It's just with citric acid, it's a little easier to make things too acidic. All right, our yarn's ready, and now I'm gonna start heating this up. I have found in the past that with stock solutions, sometimes they end up being a little more concentrated at the bottom, at the end of the bottle, than they might have been all along. And this could be if some dye crashes out of solution and sort of settled to the bottom, so that when you give those final vigorous shakes, all of a sudden you can get that suspension and use that color, which is why I recommend, if you're making a stock solution because you want to have accurate color mixtures, I recommend making that stock as close to when you want to use it as possible. But if you want to dye more by feel, and it's okay if things aren't exactly reproducible, then I'm okay using older stocks. And clearly some of these I've held on to for, I think the purple pop might be years old. The rest are just months old though. I want to dilute the dyes a bit anyway, so that way I can spread it over the yarn. And so I poured the dye into a plastic cup, and then using just cool tap water started rinsing out the jar to help us make these various colors. As a reminder, since we are using commercial acid dyes today, all of the tools and equipment that I'm using to dye this yarn, from the cups to the pan to my turkey baster, all of it is dedicated for dyeing yarn, and I never use these in the preparation of food. I didn't deal with the purple yet, but just, I mean, that blue is barely nothing. I just didn't want to overflow this container. We might pull in that purple later, but let's stick with these 4 colors for now. And what I'm doing right this second is checking the relative, oh dear, as I make a bit of a mess, but the relative intensity of these different colors that we mixed. So our true turquoise is the star. I would say that is the most intense, followed by the black, and then maybe the purple pop. The red actually may not make as big of an impact as I thought. But our pan is steamy, so let's go over there and start layering on these colors. A lot of times this might be a technique that I would do with a squeeze bottle, but I didn't feel like setting it up. And the Dharma squeeze bottles that I store the yarn in sometimes get clogged, and so I thought that we would try our turkey baster friend today. So I started with the blue because it was the most intense. I'm not really moving the yarn this stage, but we are going to layer the color multiple times in multiple ways, sort of crossing over our skeins, and I don't mind, since it's happening, we're gonna go with it and let some of these drips fall. I am not using up very much of this color that I mixed yet at all. But I do, if I don't want, so this is beautiful where we're headed right now, but if I want there to be more intensity, then we will need to be adding more dye, and we will flip this multiple times. But the plan, and I should be more careful with this red just because I have less of it, and so therefore to get that color to really read, I found that I was using more of the volume. The big reason, and I'm not bothering to wash the baster in between because everything is going to blend anyway, but the big reason to dilute things is that it gives you a little more control over the volume of colors as you add it. The turkey baster is not perfect because when using this, you can see we are getting drips around, but I'm going for something very freeing that I think you can see here. Now the nice thing about this purple color is that it will spread a lot. It breaks beautifully. It'll have blues and then pinks that spread out through everything. And this is so fun already. I'm like tempted to both not add more color right now, but I also want to add more. Ooh, I could have gone in with hearts too. That would have been fun. Adding a lot of black will definitely deepen some of these colors, but I am okay with that. I'd say we're at a medium immersion level, so I'm okay if things end up spreading a lot, but I'm also okay So I'm okay if things both blend, but I'm also okay if things sort of strike a little bit where I leave them. If we had the water level lower, then in doing this, I would definitely get more lines and less spread. But part of what gives us something that feels a little more watercolory is the fact that we have more water and things can move around. So now I've only used a fraction of the dye. It is taking a lot of self-control to not move this. And the pinks and the purple pop likely will move, and they likely will not completely set. And for reference, I see some blues in there. I mean, some of the color is absolutely striking, but there's also color left there. All right, I'm going to let this sit for 10 minutes, and then we will check more vigorously, moving things and flip and add more dye. But there's a chance that the color's not going down many layers, so having plenty of dye means we'll be able to flip and add more dye over and over and over. But this is really fun. I think I forgot to set the timer, but let's see. A lot of this color, there's some hints left, but we will have spread. And now there are a lot of different tones that we have in here, clearly. Ooh, we got some really nice spread on the other side. That is awesome. But you can see how things have blended a bit over here. As we add more color to the second side, some of this sort of softness watercolor blending will go onto that first one. So some of the contrast that we have over there may not remain. And I do want to pay close attention around the zip tie, just because it's a point where I lift, and at the ends is a place where we can see a lot of resist. But let's come in starting with our turquoise. I love this color. I hope we won't end up with a lot of bleeding. Turquoise can, I mean, all colors can bleed, but blues can be bad, pinks can be bad. I think the amount of purple pop I'm using shouldn't be an issue, but we will definitely keep an eye on it. And the thing is here, I've got a lot of dye. We don't have to use all of it. We may use most of it, but we are certainly not required to use it. So don't feel obligated to use everything up, unless you want to, of course. Okay, this time I left the red for a little later, just so that way I can have a little bit of control over its placement. But you can see how things are getting deeper the more color we add, which makes sense. But there's more, actually on camera, I feel like I'm gonna, after I add the pink, I'll maybe adjust the exposure. But I like having both the red and the pink in here. I think that that's really, really fun. And it's funny, I don't know if I've done just lines recently. I've done a lot with this technique. I frequently will do like hearts or something. It feels like more lately, but all right, let me reduce the exposure a bit so you can get a feel for the moodiness in here. And it's feeling very, very pretty, very Rebecca. I am really, really happy with how the colors are absorbing and not moving it. I do think that there's some areas where I want to add a little bit more, but actually, let's add this light blue. Actually, I'll just pour that on. That's basically no color. And there's some areas of lightness. So I'm just coming in, adding some pops of black around. I do think that I will flip at least one more time. But again, I want to make sure I remind myself to not feel pressure to use up everything. So I'll wait 10 minutes and then we'll come back. I really, really, really love this technique. This time I did set the timer. All right, we've got pinks, spread of pinks, but that is to be expected with purple pop. So we will go ahead and flip. And I want to flip and I want to open up these inside out a little bit. There we go. So then we can see where we may want to add more color, which we don't need a lot, but sometimes I have to remind myself that things look darker when they are wet than they do when dry. So sometimes I might be really, really happy with the depth and pigmentation I see when something is still really wet, but then I have moments of regret once it is dry and wished that I had added more color. But so by letting the colors strike and set each time before we move things around, this is letting us layer these colors on top of one another. If we had just poured all the dye on, we probably would have had larger sections of color, which would have still been absolutely beautiful, don't get me wrong, but just different from what we are getting this way. And while we do still have a fair amount of water in here, it's still relatively low. So when we're adding the color, it's striking pretty close to where we put it, even though there is obviously still some spread. But I think it is important to check the relative intensity of your different colors before you start layering it on, just in case you don't like how things are going. So now, I guess I'm gonna wait 10 minutes. My cups are all looking like this. I will probably rinse them and we'll pour that final dye on after we let this sit for 10 minutes on low heat. All right, I'm going to just wiggle the yarn. I mean, I don't think that there is a lot of color in this dilute. Little last bits that I'm coming in and adding, but I figured it was worth just peeking just in case. But now I am going to heat on low, I think for 20 minutes. Then I'll turn off the heat and let things cool off completely here in the pan, so that way we can absorb as much of that pink from the purple pop as possible. And then once things are really cool, we will go and wash the yarn. The dye bath cleared completely. Our yarn is cool, so now we can wash it. I love the berry color that the red gave us when it combined with the black and the blue. And this looks almost exactly like a colorway I could get with food coloring, which is really fun. It looks like a Leave No Dye Behind I did that I don't know if it'll have come out before or if it'll come out later in 2021, but where I used leftover violet and a bunch of blues and black. I got a colorway extremely similar. So I'm seeing a little bit of bleeding, which is a tiny bit surprising, but I'm not that concerned. We're dealing with the dregs of our black, which does sometimes have some residue that needs to be rinsed out. I'm going to go ahead and add a little more dish soap. Let's see how we're doing. Oh, that's not bad. We just had something we had to rinse out. Not bad at all. Now, if this ended up, and maybe not intentionally, but if this ended up being really similar to a color I got with food coloring, why use acid dyes at all? Why not just stick with food coloring? And acid dyes in general commercial acid dyes are better in terms of wash fastness and light fastness. Now, certain colors, like purple pop actually, of commercial acid dyes are less light fast than others, but I think that they are all probably more light fast than food coloring, which can fade in direct sunlight, especially when wet. So therefore, that's worth keeping in mind. So if your goal is to dye yarn for your own use, and you just want to play around with it a little bit, food coloring is an excellent way to go. I wear items that I dyed with food coloring all the time, and they hold up really, really well, as long as I don't store them on a windowsill in direct sunlight. But if you're considering moving forward and maybe opening a shop, then I would recommend getting the equipment and using commercial acid dyes. Now, in my listings, I do sometimes list items dyed with food coloring, but I always disclose in the very first paragraph of the description the dye type that I used. So that way, if someone wants something that wasn't dyed with food coloring, they can avoid it, or vice versa. But anyway, let's check. That's looking really, really good. So I am going to finish rinsing out the soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and then hang it up to dry. Before we go and film all the conclusions for this yarn, I wanted to quickly compare it to some yarn that I dyed with food coloring that I'm about to ship out to a customer, but it is so similar. They are not identical for sure. There's a little more brightness in the yarn with food coloring here, and this does have a beautiful sparkle base. But a lot of the feeling of this and sort of randomly applying dye in areas gives a very similar effect. And I just really thought it was funny because I did not go out to create a certain colorway as much as I was layering colors I knew would look well together for this video. And I ended up coming up with something that is very similar. And hey, this goes to show that a lot of the yarn that I dye with acid dyes, you can create something very similar with food coloring. It's just when you're using acid dyes, the colors are more wash fast, more light fast, in general should last a bit longer, but food coloring is a really great way to get started on your own dyeing adventures. Here is the finished dry yarn. It really shouldn't be much of a surprise how much I love this because they are my favorite colors. This is one of my favorite techniques. I love a good sparkle base. All of it came together to create something magical. Now, by randomly layering colors, you can see that we've got areas where the colors are distinct. This isn't all one color, but there is a softness to it. And we do have some patches where we can still see the red, but a lot of the red has been overtaken into some of these other purples and colors. And there's still some light areas and dark areas. It's just a very fun yarn. I do think that it is really funny that I ended up creating two colorways that are so similar to one another by dyeing by feel versus really planning what direction it will take me. I mean, this shouldn't be a huge surprise. I mean, this kind of colorway is my favorite kind of colorway. So I don't know why I'm so surprised. Maybe because I filmed them so close together. And I truly was working with what I had versus planning it out, which honestly shows one big reason why I do things like the ChemKnits dye-along challenge for myself every month to try to get myself out of my color comfort zone and to explore different combinations and ways. But it's still fun to come back to a purple-based colorway. Candace Margulis, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. I really hope you enjoy this very sparkly, purpley colorway. I love how it turned out. And I love that I accidentally created something very similar to a food coloring based colorway that I created around the same time. Those kinds of accidents are really fun, but also shows that you can create very similar type colorways, whether you want to dye yarn with acid dyes or if you're more comfortable using food coloring for your own dyeing adventures. Food coloring is how I got started after all. So anyway, Candace, once again, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. And if you would like to learn more about how you can become a lab partner of Dyepot Weekly, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. You'll find links down in the video description. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you love the yarn that I dye and want to play with some of it yourself, go and check out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. My shop is filled with hundreds of skeins of yarn that have been featured in my videos, and sometimes if you go and read the listings, you can get some sneak peeks of some content that's going to come up in the future. I also have a Patreon if that is something you would be interested in. Links to everything will be down in the description. But the biggest way that you can help support the content here is by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications. Thank you so much for watching.